Third panel of the day, let's talk about, for the next hour, the Trump administration, years 3 and 4. I'd like to remind everyone in the audience, this is not a question that's unique to the Trump administration. This is a pretty standard question halfway through the first term of any administration, let alone an administration that has suffered down ballot losses, which frankly is the norm to some extent across history, to almost all extent in the first term. And I want to get everybody warmed up appropriately on a discussion around the Trump administration with the following question, and we'll offer it to each panelist. And we'll start with Mr. Martin. And that is, imagine yourself to be an advisor to the president and the administration. You there?
I want to raise.
Okay. Now he's going to argue for the minimum wage.
No, like for me. I'm working for Trump. I want to raise.
Pay equality.
Pay equality here.
And the question to you as an advisor is, what case would you make to the president and the administration for the 1 or 2 wins you believe that they can get with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate? And I'm going to actually expand that to 2 or 3 because you're going to go infrastructure first. Now, after that.
I mean, first of all, I'm not in the business of giving any politician advice, but I would just say, from an analytical standpoint.
Well, it's a political calculation.
From an analytical standpoint, yeah. Is that better like that? So, from an analytical standpoint, like you mentioned the obvious one, the best way that they could find a sort of tangible win, and that would be, I think, in the interest of a lot of incumbents in both parties, and certainly the president himself, would be to do a bill on infrastructure. I mean, I also kind of wonder about prescription drug prices, which obviously Democrats talked lots about in the midterms. Yeah, there you go. And the president's 2016 campaign rhetoric, he was much more of a populist in tone on the campaign trail in 2016 than he has been in practice as president. Mm-hmm. I think if you wanted to return to that kind of populism, I think that... Like
a populist agenda, the issues
that matter. I mean, I think that could serve his re-election well in terms of firming up some of the voters that are more sort of Democrat in their orientation. If you could actually be able to come back to the Rust Belt in 2020 and be able to rattle off, in his mind, better trade deals, cracking down on drug companies, delivering roads, bridges, that'd be pretty formidable, right?
Right. And you, Ms. Sino?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming back after lunch. We were taking a poll to see how many people would actually come back. So we appreciate that. I think if I were advising, which I'm not, the president and his chief political people and policy people, definitely infrastructure, which I know doesn't count, but I think one has to, I say it again only because I believe infrastructure is something that perhaps the president would be able to cut some deals with. The question, though, is, one, is he willing to cut deals? The bigger question is, are Democrats willing to cut deals with him? And I also think that there's a small window, probably about 6 months, that anything could really get done before we really get in the heat of the campaign. But I do feel optimistic that there can be some compromises and some real wins. So taking that off the table, I think selfishly, I would say trade. I come from the private sector now, and trade is a very, very big issue. And I think if the president and his advisors were smart about trade and looked at it from this perspective of they've pushed business pretty far, and you start talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that they're going to be paying in tariffs, that if he were smart and would be able to cut a deal and say, okay, it's going to be 10% or it's going to be 15%, but cut a deal, end it, I think that would go a long way. And I think the other thing was, call them, they're going to have to try to neutralize or get back some of the women voters especially if you're looking at the 5 or 6 states that he's going to have to win again.
Right.
And in looking at that, take maybe a page out of his daughter's book. She had tried to push child care. If there was a deal that could be cut, pay equity, but certainly I think something that goes across gender would also be working harder on the opioid crisis. So those are, I think, the trade and
where you can get the Republican Senate and the Democratic House to come in
bipartisan.
together.
It's a good
with the
win
added
for
bonus
everybody.
of being good for his reelect.
Yes,
solid
good for
to his
everybody.
base. So go to the populist, protectionist. The world is upside down when we're talking about a Republican administration taking that position in a trade negotiation.
I would say, I hate to be the downer here, but if I were advising the president, which, like Maria, I am not, I would say there's a whole list of issues that we can be pushing, but we should not expect nor even make a real attempt at actually passing any of them or getting any of it signed into law. That's just the reality.
Does that mean, because you're thinking reelect for him?
I'm just thinking in terms of the real world and his reelect. His base doesn't want to see him go cut a bunch of compromise deals with Democrats.
Yeah.
We talked about this on one of the previous panels, there is zero upside for any of the 478 Democratic senators who are going to run for president. There is zero upside to work with the administration or in fact to even vote for anything that this administration would sign. I don't think that there's any appetite among the progressive activist base for any sort of compromise legislation with the White House. So the reality is I think we should all go into the next 2 years with exceedingly low expectations as far as what gets passed, and then we won't be disappointed.
We might just call this panel to an end. I'm actually going to challenge you on the Democratic base, not because they're all honorable and good, but I think this issue around drug prices and pre-existing conditions could be something, infrastructure being across the bill. So you're talking about sort of an evolved no compromise pledge of the Boehner-McConnell era, right? Boehner was, don't let anything from the agenda pass, and McConnell was, make sure Obama's one-term presidency. They had slight variations on the theme.
My point is about the progressive
that
base.
Each branch has in place.
Any piece of legislation that was the product of enough compromise that it could actually make it through both chambers and then be signed into law, that bill is, there's going to be a whole lot for everybody to hate in that bill. And I'll just speak for Republicans. I know people, the Trump base is not looking for him to go cut a bunch of deals that you know, the Limbaughs of the world, the Hannitys of the world are going to say are, you know, not sufficiently conservative.
Right. Josh, our newbie to the panel, but not newbie to the conference.
Right. Thanks. So, I mean, there's a lot to chew on that's out here. So Todd's put out this extreme situation where nothing's going to get done, which may very well turn out to be the case. The question was, what could get done in this particular context?
What would you advise that you think could
and I
get
mean,
done?
I think that
your advice could be don't do anything. It could
Right.
be Stonewall.
Right. So to sort of back up a little bit, I think the question would be, from my perspective, is what are the things that we need to know the answer to in order to try to figure out whether we're going to get something where compromise can be done. I think there's two questions here that'll be at the heart of this. And one is, there was a lot of talk during the campaign about the extent to which Trump had any ideological commitment to anything, right? And the question of, if he won the election, would he be in a situation where he would govern in a way that was different from a lot of traditional Republican priorities? And we saw this one attempt where there was an attempt to reach across the aisle to Schumer and Pelosi, which then sort of looked like it was happening for a second, and then it kind of foundered afterwards. Now that we have a House in place that's Democrat and the Senate still being Republican, we're going to get a little bit more clarity, I think, on this particular case. And I think the issue is, does he want to continue down the path of being, the one thing he's going to do is stay loyal to his base, keep his base excited, in which case I think Todd is explaining the world. The other thing is he pivots and he wants to be the guy who makes deals, because that was another thing he ran on. And if he does want to be the guy who makes deals, then the question is it doesn't only become what can he compromise on the House with, we almost have to ask what can he compromise on the Senate with, right? Like what can he bring the Senate along to get? And I do think, like everybody said so far, like infrastructure is the one deal you can come up with, which I don't think there's going to end up being a tremendous amount that people are complaining about. And the question is, going into, so how far, normally we would say, how much are you going to open up your right flank, right, to the Limbaughs and the Hannitys? The question is, how much has Trump completely insulated himself about having his right flank exposed, right? If you're Hannity, right, or you're Limbaugh, are you really going to try to take down Trump 18 months before an election because the infrastructure bill has the wrong mix of public versus private, partnership in it? This is a guy who did the caravan for you. This is a guy who got Kavanaugh, who got Gorsuch, right? He may be immune from having that right flank. And it might be this simultaneous thing where he's a guy who's solidified his right flank because he enjoyed doing it, and yet doesn't actually care about policies on the right, and so might be perfectly comfortable adopting policies on the left, to go along with this. And what we, as sort of scholars studying public opinion around issues in the United States, have been sort of so stunned by is how quickly you can flip longstanding partisan beliefs about particular issues in this current climate where partisanship rules everything. So if I had slides, I'd show you this great slides about attitudes towards the CIA. Right? You think of the CIA of the 60s and the 70s or the FBI of Hoover, right? I show you right after the election, Republicans didn't like the CIA. Democrats loved the CIA. The FBI, Democrats loved the FBI. Republicans hate the FBI. Right. Trade, of all things, right? Trade. Republicans hate free trade. Democrats love free trade, right? Like, things are just inverting so quickly. Yes. So he has shown already the ability to bring his base on issues that we wouldn't have thought he could bring his base on. The only one that there seems to be some resistance to is Russia, right? That's the one thing he seems incapable of bringing at least enough of his base to bring the rest of the Republican Party along with him. But the rest of these issues are open. So I think the question becomes, and then the second question I think that's key here is, does Trump decide that he's interested in governing or that he just wants to campaign? If he just wants to campaign, which is what that
Would anybody like to vote on that now?
Right. Which is what that first press conference looked like, right? Then Todd's right. There's no incentive to do anything because you might as well just beat up on the Democrats.
Look, I think he's got the latitude with his base to do it. I think there's nobody on the right that would give him much grief, or at least grief that mattered, if he was to pursue a deficit spending infrastructure bill, or if he was to crack down on drug companies and the spirit of William Jennings Bryan.
Populist friend.
Yeah, sure, but the issue is not that he wouldn't be able to do it. The issue is his own lack of focus and his own preference to basically watch cable news and react to whatever's in the news and drive a sustained legislative agenda, coupled with the fact he's surrounded by more conventional people in the White House who kind of check his impulses at times. The other half of that equation being that Democrats, and Todd mentioned this, that it's very tough for Democrats to work with this president now because their base is make that very difficult for them. I think the question that is sort of more interesting in hindsight is what could have happened in January of 17, actually, right? I think that the barn door is now wide open, but what could have happened in January of 17 if Trump came out and had some folks around him who wanted to basically create a new coalition? He could have squeezed the heck out of both wings of both parties in Congress, and he could have really, done fascinating things. It would have been a poli-sci dream. Yeah. But instead, he didn't understand Washington. He didn't know anything about Congress. He basically deferred to Paul Ryan, Ryan's previous Mitch McConnell, and of course, their agenda was repeal the Affordable Care Act and pass tax cuts. So he then became a sort of pretty conventional Republican. And I think the combination of becoming a conventional Republican on policy and then acting in very controversial, divisive, inflammatory ways has made it hard for him to kind of recapture that ability to be a different kind of president now, because there's just no interest among Democrats to kind of like help that cause, I don't think. I mean, if Democrats tried to work with him to like do some big bipartisan stuff, I think some of them would be willing to do it. I think lots of them would have a hard time doing it, right? Like, you're with the president in the Rose Garden 1 minute trying to pass a prescription drug bill. Like that afternoon, he's talking about like refugees and like immigrants and the caravan.
Well,
that's tough if you're a Democrat member of Congress. You know?
Well, I want to, Josh, for the scholarly amongst you, I would just tell you as a longtime communications director, he shouldn't feel like Hannity and those guys are going to be with him under any circumstances. Your opinion media will flip on you on a dime on both sides of the aisle, by the way. You set up, Jonathan, what is the second part of that? If advising is the first element of what is the substance to be addressed, whether successfully or unsuccessfully, the second, it is common for there to be significant succession in the senior team. Now, this president's had a lot of succession already happening. And so what I would ask each of you to do is to identify where, for the second half of the first term, you see turnover and who some of those personalities are and what they may be like. And by the way, this is not about sort of dramatic presidential personality taking heads off on a Friday afternoon. This is really common. People like don't see their families for a year. And somebody says, I can't do that anymore. This is even in the most successful, happy, loving, hugging, kumbaya administration, never. But where do we see succession going, Maria? Maria's been at this decision point before in her career.
Listen, I think that there's natural burnout. You don't see your family. You're working 18 hours a day. People even actually get mono and get sick. Or have ulcers.
Heart attacks.
Yeah. The other thing is, nobody ever wants to talk about this too. It's financial. Many of us have lived paycheck to paycheck for years when we were in public service because we loved what we did. But then at some point, it doesn't become realistic. So after you take enough jobs and you're giving everybody else raises except yourself, so there's a financial element. I think everyone will probably say the same thing. The White House, I feel that there'll probably be somewhat of a significant turnover. I think the burnout rate, as you talk to people, is great. If you talk to headhunters out there, they're already saying that people are talking to them because they want out. And also, I think in many cases, these guys have been beaten up pretty bad. It's been a really, really, I know we all have served in the administration, many of us have served in the administration, and we always say it's really tough. I have to believe that this was probably maybe a little bit more stressful. I don't know if anyone would disagree with that, but I'm not going to ask. So I think the White House, you're going to see significant turnover. And depending on what individuals you'll be able to attract, it'll be really interesting because there's a learning curve. And we already went through a learning curve this first go-around. And to start another learning curve when you're going into a re-election, it'll be really interesting. And I also think you're going to see some of, today it was announced, one of the things in political, I think, was Mathis. Is he the next one? But you start looking at the cabinet, and can we actually confirm anybody to go into these are really, 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 being a cabinet secretary, even a deputy secretary, really important jobs. And somebody has to be running these agencies. The White House cannot run all of them. So I think that you've got 3 or 4 agencies, hopefully not more, but possibly, where you can see Department of Commerce, Department of Interior, for different reasons for each one that I won't bore you guys with, DOD. If you start losing some of these folks, you've got trade, you've got defense, it's a setback.
Well, Todd, let me ask a follow-on to that, which is, okay, let's say whether by their own choice or the president's choice, 3 to 4 cabinet positions are up for grabs. So traditionally, what you see, or anecdotally, I should say, is close friends walk qualified, big supporters come in and get a couple of those cabinet positions. Everybody has their bumpy waters, and then you go get the professionals for the second round. In term 2, by the way, the last 2 years are all the staff who grew up and learned the subject, and they get the principal positions in the last 2 years of an 8-year term. So who, given this administration, are they going to look for? Is he going to go look for more loyalists or more experts?
Talk about a softball.
Can I answer
I
that?
just want to point out that the La Pietra dialogues have had an impact, and friendships are built everywhere, like this one.
Kiki's announcing she's going into the cabinet.
Yes.
Not that friendship.
You know, I would say you want to know what pool of people to look to, or at least people whose last name is not already Trump. Look at Republican candidates who lost.
Yes.
Very cool.
You know,
Attorney General
10 days.
Kobach.
Yes. Yes. Chris.
Get ready
Chris,
for it.
Chris Kobach.
News made right
Yeah,
here today.
you definitely can fail up in this environment. So I would look at any member who ran and lost that is viewed as a Trump loyalist. A lot of these Republican House members that lost, especially ones who held more suburban districts, if they were viewed as too Trumpy and lost, I think that is absolutely the first pool of people that he will look to.
Josh, does White House staff, based on whatever agenda they come up with, let's say they take the Todd agenda, not your agenda, but Todd's agenda of, we'll pick off a few things that we'll pretend to fight for but don't have the expectation of winning, so that the campaigner-in-chief remains advocate-in-chief for his base. If you're White House staff, are you looking for sort of a neutral kind of cabinet secretary at the agency that's engaged in that issue, or do you want a powerhouse secretary?
The question, I mean, the bigger question is who's making these decisions about, is it White House staff or is it who Trump wants for these positions, right? And so if we think that
Is there any
so
chance
much of
it's
this
together?
comes through, I mean, if it
guessing.
comes through, I mean, because I think the question I think if you ask the White House staff are going to want expertise. They're going to want people who are competent. And if you ask Trump,
hang on. Would everybody here who's ever been in administration agree that they always wanted expertise as a cabinet head, if you're White House staff?
Never been in administration.
in this context,
Well, in general, I was just asking historically, because I'm not sure every White House staff has always wanted that. But go ahead.
I mean, I would think in this context, if you're Kelly, right, you want people who are not going to have fires burning every single day. This is an administration that's been characterized by a kind of chaos. Now, whether it's a controlled chaos that the president wants to have in place because that's the environment in which he thrives, or it's an inadvertent chaos because of the reasons people have raised previously about lack of familiarity with how this kind of works. So I think if you're the staff, you're going to want people who are going to not have fires going all the time. I think there's nothing about Trump that we've seen so far to suggest that what he values above all else is going to be loyalty. So I mean, I think that's going to be the issue, rather than whether it's a strong figure as opposed to a sort of steady as you go figure here. I think that's what they're going to be looking for in these particular cases. And I think the important question marks on cabinet appointments is going to be, you know, is can you get people through the Senate? And I think in this particular case, even though we might look at this and think, again, going back 2 years, that the Senate might have been a bulwark trying to push the president towards certain types of candidates, holding back from approving other types of candidates. Yeah. One of the most interesting things we've learned in the first 2 years is that it doesn't appear that Senate Republicans are inclined to do that in any particular case. And with the outcome of the election, with the Senate still in the hands of Republicans, I think you have to assume there's a larger space from which you could choose the people who are going to be appointed to these positions than there might have been, obviously, had the Democrats won, but even if the Republicans in the first 2 years in the Senate had seemed inclined to sort of try to exert authority. And I think, and I'd be interested in hearing from the rest of the panel, the extent to which, you know, it's Trump's party now, this seems to have even declined from where it might have been, where you might have expected a Lindsey Graham to push back in a way that he doesn't seem to be now.
So let me pose a different kind of question. If a lot of our conversation today has really been about structure, hard politics, infrastructure of the party, not the country, and elections, one thing we haven't really talked about is the economy, right? The U.S. economy, its role or lack thereof in the general election. And if you're getting an administration ready for a re-election, you kind of care about where the economy is in the next 18 months. Things like gas prices, a flip of inflation. There is this, you know, constant rumor mongering of the inflation that's to come, given the amount of the deficit, with the low unemployment. Even a liberal arts grad like me knows what the rules are around that. Jonathan, how come nobody's talking to the president on this team about the economy and what do you need to do in the next 18 months?
I mean, I think if there was any major lesson, 20,000-foot lesson from this midterm, is that people are now voting their identity more than they are their pocketbooks.
So it's not the economy, stupid?
I don't want to steal Maria's PowerPoint here, but it's not the economy, stupid. Yeah. No.
I want to share with you.
Look, it's just it's a truism. I actually called Carville a couple months ago because God bless my editors. We were doing a story. This is back in September, and they're like, the economy is rolling. Like, why aren't folks going to reward the in party on the economy? And so I teed up Carville to sort of do a version of it. It's not the economy, stupid. It's Trump, stupid. People were voting based upon their perception of this president and his conduct in office more than anything else. And their 401ks or their employment prospects mattered less to them than their support or their revulsion towards the president. And I just don't think that that's going to change. Look, could a huge recession hurt him? Of course it could, going into 20. But I think that the larger issue in this country is that this country, although actually here too, but folks vote identity, and that's why you see this education and class gap in American politics, because the people who are doing great at the top of the pyramid scheme and all of these suburbs that we're talking about that we're blue in the face, they're the ones who are voting against the party in control because they don't like the behavior. So I just think that the time spent on the economy is too much because it's just not what drives folks anymore.
So Todd, you're on the reelect. Okay, you're not really on the reelect, but pretend you're on the reelect, and you started your meetings, right? Like this week, you were starting stuff earlier, but now you're allowed to actually show up together and have lunch and start figuring it out. Are you at the table saying these forecasts on the economy are a little dangerous, or we need to do more? Ledge team, can you go do a little block and tackle? You know, Treasury, what's happening? You care about it or you don't on the reelect? For a presidential, not a midterm, in a presidential.
You care about it because you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot with self-inflicted economic wounds, but Jonathan is spot on that when people in this political environment, as soon as people put their jerseys on, that and only that is the primary driver of how they're going to vote. I was telling Joel earlier, I did the Kim Reynolds governor's race in Iowa, and I actually had a soybean farmer say to me that, he was a little worried about everything that was going on with trade, but he said, but Trump, this is the guy that wrote The Art of the Deal, right. So I know that he knows what he's talking about, and I'm going to be patient.
So we're just now at the end of harvest. Does another year of that, if it goes south, make a dent in that?
We had talked internally.
This is years 3 and 4 we're talking about.
We had talked internally on the campaign, on the Reynolds campaign, because I was trying to get a sense of when do people, because everything that they do is, it's months in advance.
When you take your bank loans, when you decide what you grow.
So I wanted to know, like, any negative impact from trade, when does that actually show up in somebody's bank account? And it was not until after the election, and I was curious. I asked that exact same question. Once people if they start seeing it in their bank account, will that loyalty hold? And I guess that's an unknown question for 2020.
Well, I'm sure there are other people here who were raised on a farm, but you can ask my husband later who was. And after the session, he can tell us what he thinks on the cycle. Josh.
Yeah, so I want to jump in on 2 points here. First, I want to completely agree with Todd about this putting on your jerseys and partisanship and how much partisanship is coming to structure the way I talked before about issues. We have a new survey that we just recently released. It's called the 2018 U.S. American Institutional Confidence Poll that was released by the Baker Center at Georgetown that I worked on with them. And we found that like fundamental things like just confidence in institutions generally, we were looking, was it going down? It's all about partisanship. I mean, the courts, the press, universities and colleges, right? The only thing Americans agree on is they all like the military and they all like Amazon. And nobody really likes Facebook. But other than that, it really is split across these institutions by partisanship. But I want to push back on Jonathan's comment before about the economy not mattering. And I think that in this particular situation, the personality of Trump is masking the value of the strong economy. So I don't think we're sure yet that a strong economy still doesn't matter in boosting an incumbent because partisanship has overwhelmed this. What we know right now is if you regress the state of the economy on presidential popularity, given how good the economy is in the United States, that Trump should be at about 60% approval ratings. So for those of you who follow sabermetrics in sports, you may have heard of this value over replacement statistic. It's how much better is a particular player you might want to sign than the average player. Trump's value over replacement president is negative 20%, right? So if you throw in a generic Republican into this position, you would expect, or a generic Democrat with how good the economy, they would be doing much better. So in the course of the election, we know midterm elections are basically a function of the state of the economy, who's got control of the presidency, and the presidential approval rating. So actually, Trump may have undercut, by dint of his personality in this particular case, the strength of the economy, which is the same thing Jonathan was saying. The question is whether this is a Trump-specific effect, that this is a historically bad candidate in sort of harnessing support from the population at large, or this is a structural feature of the kind of growing polarization of the situation in the United States, and whether another presidential candidate in this economy wouldn't be benefiting much more from the economy. And I would say the jury's probably still out on that. I would lean towards it being the latter case, but we're going to have to see in the future.
All right, I'm gonna do a little summation here, and then I want to ask one last question. I want to go to the audience for questions. But what I'm hearing, because I want to make sure I get this right, is maybe get an infrastructure bill done within 6 months, but there's really not a legislative agenda that has value across all three chambers, not branches, but chambers, to make it worth doing, because somebody's going to have a problem somewhere. And there's probably a whole nother panel to be done on Mitch McConnell, right, and what his path is. And it's probably heavily judges-oriented,
yeah.
right? Okay, and then what I just heard is no longer is the media consultant and the re-elect important. It's all the field director, because everybody's just going to put on their jersey. There's no conversion. There's no
bad news
messaging.
for Todd Harris.
Right. I'm just saying. I mean,
Wait,
that's what
no.
That's what you're.
Well, before we start cutting media
I figured
budgets.
I could get a few minutes used up on this. Go ahead, Todd.
That line item is coming out of the budget?
Right.
Okay, when it comes to voter contact.
I love Todd Harris talking about voter contact.
Well, yes, because television contacts more voters than
Yes,
anybody
of course it
else.
does.
So you got three phases in terms of your messaging with in a big statewide race that would have multiple ads. Step one is your introduction. Okay, hi, I'm Todd Harris. I grew up this way, whatever. Step two is your persuasion. Okay.
Yes.
Step three is motivation.
Yes.
So we're cutting out the second step, the persuasion step, because we're not changing a whole lot of minds to put different jerseys on, but the motivation piece is still critically important.
But it's not about moving anybody. It's not Red Rover, why won't you come out? I mean, it's not about moving anybody over. It's all about now. We saw a tremendous increase in voter participation this cycle, right, on both sides. And now it's a matter of, can you top that on either side or bring all of them into the next side? And really, Mr. President, a legislative agenda, pretend to have one, but just power through. No pre-buttal, no defense on the economy necessary, Maria?
you know, I'll go back to James Carville. It's the economy, stupid. I'm just not sure that the economy is an issue for Republicans. They love that issue. He already has Republicans. Now, can he keep them motivated? That will be determined.
Right.
But when you go to Democrats, it's health care, it's immigration, it's guns. You know, the economy's in there, but it's not the top 2 or 3. So we can keep talking about the economy. And, you know, maybe in James, who is a dear, dear friend, I'm godmother to both his children. At the end of the day, I think, I'll just give you one. More satisfied with the economy. In November of 2018, 28% said yes, they were more satisfied. And 10 years earlier, 10 years earlier, the number was virtually the same, 27%. Right. 10 years ago, the economy was not where it is today, right? But yet they're saying the same.
Same experience with it.
I think it's a little bit of what Jonathan said.
So before we go to the floor, I am going to bring up one issue that has yet to come up today, and I thought particularly it might come up somewhere in the legislative. Maybe it was my own personal hope. DACA. Nobody's raised it today. We've talked a lot about health care, Martha, but no DACA today yet. DACA, nobody walks into the Oval or into McConnell's office and says, let's try to get something, some little, and by the way, when I say some little bitty something, I say little bitty for the left as well as the right, because extremists on both sides, I believe, killed this last time.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of Trump would like to do a deal where he could get money for a border wall in exchange for DACA, and I think that will be the temptation that folks like Lindsey Graham will try to pitch. The problem there is he's got voices in his ear, both in the White House and in the Senate, who don't want that to happen. And I think that what happened last year was that those voices won out, and I'm not sure why that would be any different in the lead up to his own reelection.
Josh, any insight on your part?
I mean, you know, I had that written down when you asked what are the potential issues that are out there. But again, I think it goes back to this question of, does he want to go into the campaign as the deal maker, right? Which we thought maybe, going back to Jonathan saying, like, what it could have happened in January of 2017. There was uncertainty about this. And if there's one thing I've learned about Trump, it's that you can't actually predict his behavior tomorrow from today, ever, about anything. So would it be crazy out of the realm of thing if he switches gears right now and tries to cut a bunch of deals? You know, I think we've all hit our heads against the wall trying to predict what he's going to do on different things. If the answer is you need a long sustained effort to build this coalition with presidential leadership, is that going to happen? No, that's not going to happen. So, I mean, is this one of the things that they could do something on? You know, there are definite interests here, and we've seen the contours of this thing, but we've also seen all the rocks that it can kind of bump up against.
Stephen Miller, Tom Cotton.
Yeah, right.
End of story.
Those are your speed bumps. Blockades, barricades. Okay, let's go to the floor and see if we have any questions. Uh-oh, that's my husband. I don't know if that's a conflict. I'm going to call on Karen Finney first, then I'll come to you. I'm calling on Karen Finney first.
So we keep referencing the economy, but in the reality-based system that we live, I think I would assume part of the reason that Republicans they did not talk about it more, is that the truth is, for middle and low-income people, it's not better. I mean, in terms of actual wage growth, it's not better, and costs are going up. And, you know, even like in the African-American community where Trump says there are fewer African-Americans unemployed. Okay, but the economy has sucked for black people for a long time, so it's like it sucks a little less is still, which is what you hear from voters when you talk to them. So I guess I feel like the economy, my question to the panel is, the truth is, the economy is not a winning issue right now for the people that you really need to actually turn out and vote. For suburban folks, as Jonathan pointed out, they got their tax cut or they didn't, and so they're able to focus on other issues. Right. But if you're living closer to the bone, it's not that much better.
Which then feeds the desire to not have the president go out and promote the economy, is your point. And your thesis or your question?
No, so my question is does somebody have a different view as to why not the economy? And what I would say is also, it strikes me that when we talk about these, jerseys people put on, like, I think one of the biggest mistakes Democrats always make is to talk down to rural voters, and certain voters could say, well, they're voting against their economic interests, when I think people are voting for what they believe their values and their faith is, and they don't speak to that. So that's where I guess my question is, do you think that part of the issue with some of these lower income voters who vote for Trump, you don't have to make the argument about the economy because they're with him on something totally different.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we did. People who like Trump think that because they heard, on Fox News that the economy is great, and so therefore the economy is great. I was not involved in a single campaign this cycle where we were having sustained arguments in the general election about the state of the economy. We talked a lot about taxes, a lot about tax cuts, but at least none of my candidates, we weren't talking about the economy, which is not to say that the economy isn't in good shape, but anyone who thinks that the economy is in good shape is already voting for us.
Well, to Karen's point and to Maria's point, though, just a reminder that I think you're actually in alignment with Karen, which is the number stays the same.
Yeah,
Talking about the economy is not moving it up or down because some people are voting on a different element. And so if you're thinking about for the Trump administration, what to do, that's a different function. All right, I'll call on my husband, Joe.
Can I just
Oh, wait, actually, yeah, sorry, Joe.
Yeah,
Josh has something to say.
so there's always a question about whether these aggregate level models are correctly picking up what people think at the individual level. But I think the one thing to just really keep in mind when thinking about the economy, these very sparse models about the economy and who is in control of the White House really, really well predicted the popular vote in 2016. They were just remarkably accurate. They should have been a slight victory for the incumbent party, and that's exactly what happened with the popular vote. And my point that I was trying to make before about how Trump is historically unpopular given the state of the economy, that doesn't mean necessarily that the economy doesn't matter right now. It means that the Republican Party probably underperformed in the midterm elections compared to what it should have done with this economy. What then happens if we think elections are a function of presidential approval in the state of the economy? The question is, they've got much less cushion if it starts to get worse. Right, and so it's too soon to say the economy doesn't matter anymore. It's a lot easier to be concerned about values when the economy is sort of humming along. Right. And there's a history of people not caring about the economy when it's doing well, but caring a ton about the economy when it does badly. And there was massive stimulus in this, in this tax bill, right, which is going to wear out at some point. So going back to the question, should they be worried about this in the Trump White House? Yeah. It might not be enough to ride to victory, but it certainly could be something if it goes south that will presage defeat.
My old boss, John Breaux, a Democrat from Louisiana, used to say, in much less scholarly terms, this is all about how much pie you've got. And if there's enough pie for you to feed all your kids a piece of pie, then we can talk about issues that are in the culture, about how we live our lives, not are we living at all. If they were down to one slice of pie, I'm going to close up my heart, and I don't care anything about what you need to live fully in your life. I'm going to worry about my kids. And I do think this could become a challenge to some degree. 2 years may not be enough time, but for the Trump administration to address. Okay, I'm going to go for my husband and then one of my dearest friends. How about that? The conflicts
that was a wise choice.
Thank you.
And we love Joel too. You guys really haven't addressed the 700-pound bear in the room. Because regardless of the Mueller investigation and what happens there, if the leadership in the Democratic Congress, the House of Representatives, decides to return to a more traditional role of the legislative oversight of the executive branch, it fundamentally changes the relationship and the political dynamic between Congress and the White House. And I don't think anybody quite knows how that's going to work out, but I'd like to see what you think.
I mean, it's hard to look into the crystal ball, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, look.
But Jonathan, whichever way it goes.
Right.
Right? Whichever way it goes, there's going to be oversight, and he's going to be mad, and he's already decided to declare war.
Right. I mean, no, it's a good point. I mean, we're talking about what Trump could do with the Democratic House and the Republican Senate, but you're right though. If there's real damage done politically by the Mueller investigation, and of course that's going to trigger not just potentially an impeachment inquiry, but perhaps simultaneous investigations in the House along the lines of whatever Mueller has found. So that could stymie any cooperation from the get-go. It's an important point that will sort of set the predicate for what's going to happen in the next 2 years, what he finds. If if you think back to what happened, I think President Clinton and the Republican Congress could have done some major things in his second term, especially on entitlements, and obviously that came to an end with the Lewinsky scandal.
Let me reframe that slightly for you, Murray, because the concept of managing the relationship between between opposing parties of a House, because it could be a variety of issues. That's the more dramatic issue of how do you manage that? Is there any room to?
So I would say it didn't work so well for us during the Clinton administration for the Republicans. And I'm not saying that history repeats itself, but it does. And I think that could be a potential waste of 2 years, which when you come to the presidential, you're giving us Republicans, and we may or may not appreciate that, the fact that at the end of the day, well, here we are, the thing that you said you were going to change. All of these new 20% new members coming in, you're going to change this. You weren't elected on partisanship. These are the issues that you wanted to talk about. And guess what? You didn't talk about any of them. You didn't talk about health care. You didn't talk about opioids. You didn't talk about tax cuts for the middle class. And all you want to do is the same thing that you criticized your opponents for. I would say if you did that, all bets are off as to what might happen in 2020.
All right, let's go to Joel. There's a mic coming for you.
To clarify how people voted on the economy. People in the exit polls who said the economy was excellent or good totaled 68% of the electorate. Trump won them by 20 points, converting to about a net plus of 13.5. The 31% who said the economy was not so good or poor voted 83 to 14, which is a net of plus 21, actually converting to the 8.5% margin on the House races. The reason I'm calling that out is because I believe the discussion about the economy that you've had on two levels is one we had after 2016, where we were very conscious when we talked, and Kevin, I don't know if he's still here, we talked about how with Obama, we never talked about the macro economy, that those metrics were irrelevant to people. We always talked about their lives and the microeconomic struggles that they were having. Now, the question I have and everybody can answer based on that, and I think that still holds true.
But isn't that exactly what I said?
Well, but the way you said the economy is good, but you weren't getting credit for it, I believe.
No,
people.
I said people who liked the economy were generally speaking already with us.
Also, people are answering that question on the basis of partisanship.
No, I do not believe that. I believe they're answering it based on the factors in their lives that they say aren't better. And so my question is,
there are people answering that exit poll who would give a different answer.
I understand, but I polled this through 2 presidential elections also, Josh, so I know how people translate the economics. The stock market means nothing to them, GDP means nothing to them, and most of the time unemployment numbers mean nothing to them. Whether their paychecks are going up, whether they can afford the drugs and the food bills that they're paying in their household matters.
Gas.
So let me get to the question, and gas. Let me get to the question, and everybody can answer, but I think Maria and Todd may be first. Trump's inability really to acknowledge problems. He's talked about, the election night was an incredible night for Republicans. This economy is the greatest in history, right? Does his inability to be able to downgrade that exuberance, to connect with more people than he's connecting with, will that hamper him and Republicans in 2020 if their economic status and their lives are pretty much in the same place?
That's a good question.
Yeah, please, Maria, I'm curious.
You've got too many numbers. You're way ahead of us. Listen, I think 2 years to the next election is a lifetime, and there's going to be a lot of factors in that. And I wish I could say it's just the economy, and I don't think it is going to be. We could have a national disaster. We could have an international disaster. But ultimately, I'll just go back to, at the end of the day, Republicans are generally always concerned, number one or number two is the economy. But he already has those voters, I believe, unless something that we don't know about happens. And how can he get more Democrats? I'm not sure it's going to be through the economy. And that's what they have to figure out, I believe, as they move forward, if they can try to neutralize or increase. So I'm not really sure.
So you're saying the debate about whether the economy plays in the next election is actually a question for the Democrats and about how they use it and what they do with it.
But can I just say one more thing? I mean, it's kind of like nobody looks at their 401k when it's going up, right? But the minute there's that 300, 400, or 500 point drop, everybody looks at it. But people are going to bitch no matter what, because they always want more. We're at 20. We were at 27,000 at the on the stock market, and people wanted to go higher. I can remember when it was 9,000. It was like, oh my God, will we ever get to 10? So if things are good, they're good. But if they're bad, I think that's when people really will react. And,
I would avoid your question this way.
He's honest. He's honest.
Elections, as you know, candidates are never in a vacuum in an election, and I always will remind, all of my hardcore Trump friends that we shouldn't, while there is much to be learned and read into Trump's victory, we should never forget the fact that there were a whole lot of people that voted for Donald Trump because they just didn't like Hillary Clinton. And so I think it's difficult to answer your question without knowing, what is the other side of that equation? But who is he going to be judged against?
Yes.
It's all, and every election is relative.
Yeah.
Right? All right, as somebody who started her career as a campaign scheduler, I'm not gonna mar my record. You'll have to save it for the next panel.
Politics.
And I survived it. It is 3:31, and I want to thank our panelists and thank the dialogue from the audience for today.
Thank y'all.
Great.
good job, Kiki.